Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the third in our series of little pride conversations that I've been doing with folks from our church congregation over the last few weeks, marking Pride Month. I hope you had a chance to watch the first two that we did. The first one was with Graham, second one with Amanda, had some really lovely perspectives to share with us about their experiences. And I'm continuing with this little series with another guest this evening. So I'm back on Zoom again, rather than in the church as I was with Amanda last week. So by the power of Zoom, I'm going to press the very magic button and use gallery to reveal my guest. Da, 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 da. Oh, that way, maybe on the screen. There we go. So I am joined this evening by the Reverend David Newman, who is just going to introduce himself a bit, tell you who he is, what he's doing in Loughborough, what he's doing at All Saints. And tell us who you are, David.
Thanks, Wendy. Well, I'm a retired vicar. I've ended up in All Saints as a place to worship in my retirement. Before retiring, I was the warden of Laund Abbey, which is the diocesan retreat house for Leicester and for Peterborough Diocese, but with a national profile. And before that, I was Archdeacon of Loughborough. And before that, I was a rector in Loughborough. So I've been in the East Midlands for quite a long time now and hold various ministry roles, but have found myself now in retirement, happily in the congregation at All Saints.
I have to say, David is a very good advert for being a retired clergy person. Yes, or being a retired archdeacon. I should say as well, David is responsible for me being at All Saints. So however you feel about that, you can put that at David's feet. He was the archdeacon who appointed me. And I always say, David, you're much older and wiser than me. So I'm really, really glad that you've come to join me this evening for this little conversation.
My wisdom stands or falls then on what people think about the appointment.
Oh dear, I apologise. So obviously in our little pride conversations, I'm wanting to talk to people about different people's experiences and also their perspectives in the light of it being Pride Month. And I'm really aware that when we talk about particularly same-sex relationships, I want people to know that I think it's okay to sort of be on a journey with this. And that's partly because I acknowledge that, you know, everyone's upbringing and what they experience as their cultural norms is different. And I often say that I grew up with what I would call in my family as benign homophobia. Now, I recognise that for people on the receiving end of that, there's probably nothing benign about that. But what I mean by that is I think culturally in the 1980s, I was in a context of thinking same-sex relationships probably weren't quite right, but my family wouldn't want to be horrible to anybody who was like that. But it was actually because of my Christian faith, because I believed in this God of love and that the greatest commandment was to love my neighbour and all these things, that led me on my own journey of going, hold on a minute, I want to think about this. And I feel I'm at odds actually with this homophobic culture that actually was sort of upbringing at school and so on. So I wanted to ask you, David, if you would share with us, being older than me as you are, what your
careful
where you started and what has been your journey around your understanding, particularly around same-sex relationships.
Well, my background is in the evangelical tradition in the Church of England, so that will immediately say a bit about the place from which I've been coming. Also, I would say, being a little bit older than you, Wendy, those sort of things that you've just talked about, I would recognize too. And so it was easy to have convictions about human sexuality and same-sex relationships and so on, that seemed to be what was coming out of Scripture, which was obviously important to me from that sort of tradition within the church, but have them unchallenged by contact with a lot of real gay people, because I think it was easy to live in a more of a bubble and people were more secretive, less open, much less talked about. So you didn't have those convictions tested in a sense by real human experience. And it was much easier to live with the idea that essentially sex was for marriage, and marriage was between a man and a woman. And you know, that was your basic sexual ethic to live by. So I think that was my starting point. And I guess over the years, in the first instance, that has been challenged by meeting more and more real gay people, finding that in my congregations as a church leader, there were living faithful, holy Christian lives, bearing the fruit of love and devotion to God and faithful service and many things that were perfectly impressive in terms of their Christian lives, but actually from a perspective of having same-sex attraction and maybe even being in a same-sex relationship. So immediately, therefore, my sort of theoretical framework was challenged by real human beings.
Yeah. I really recognize that. I remember as I was growing up, and I thought that I would deal with this complex issue by I just wouldn't meet gay people. That would be how I would handle this situation of not being able to fit together my kind of like, how does this work? And then gradually, you grow up, we go out to work, all these things. And suddenly this is not an issue that's over there, but this is the people that I know. And actually that begins to start to sort of, to challenge your perspective. So as you were sort of thinking these things, I mean, did you ever share that with your church? Did you, or at what point did you feel confident enough to sort of say, well, actually I'm thinking, or I feel I want to say something slightly different to the received wisdom?
Well, I think that probably came when I was the rector of Emmanuel Church, which you'll know all too well, is the next door parish to your own. And it was quite clear we had different perspectives within that congregation. It felt important to me that this was a subject that was talked about, that was openly discussed, that we had a framework for good conversation. Because it's actually it's all too easy to put people into boxes or to have black and white answers if you're not really engaging in dialogue with people. And also, I think pastorally that's very important, that people can feel that even if someone disagrees with them, they are listened to. They have an opportunity to speak about their experiences and so on. So we did try and be open in our conversation at Emmanuel. I'm sure we could have done more, but so I'd say that was part of the journey for me. And I think it also began to impress on me that with the starting point that I had, basically, sex was for marriage and marriage was for men and women. On the first of those, there was clearly a huge pressure on that understanding, not just from the same-sex community, but heterosexual relationships, were not following that old anymore. I probably took, most of the weddings I took, people were already living together. So we had to start thinking through our sexual ethics in a different way. But in terms of same-sex relationships, it began to seem to me that just to say that celibacy was the only answer and abstinence from sex and so on was just not good enough. That it was essentially negative and life-denying. And more than that, for me, coming from an evangelical position, it was not scriptural. And this may be, I got invited to write a chapter in a book called Journeys in Grace and Truth, which was a book where people from the evangelical tradition were invited to describe the journey of understanding about human sexuality that they'd been on. And in writing that chapter, I think it became very clear to me that both Jesus and the Apostle Paul talked about celibacy, mainly from a heterosexual point of view, but were quite clear that this wasn't a gift that everybody had. I can remember in my young days, my curate and youth leader, when we were talking about marriage and relationships, and we were looking at Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7, and Paul says, it's better to marry than to burn with passion. And he looked at me and said, David, I think you're the burning kind, if you don't mind me saying so. And I'd have to own that I think marriage for me was an incredibly important part of giving me a good discipline to my desires, my sexual desires and so on. And yet here I was threatening to withhold that means of grace to people with same-sex attraction.
It is so good to... We're having a small Dalek moment where I think possibly David's Wi-Fi may have slightly buffered, but I think we got most of that. It was the burning desires and passions. David clearly sent the internet into meltdown, but it's really good for me to hear you owning scripture in this, because the other thing that the other narrative that's around a little bit at the minute, and this gets thrown at me sometimes in gentle ways, sometimes in quite harsh ways, is that either you're a Bible believing Christian or you're in favor of same-sex relationships and LGBT rights, and you can't be both, and that really grieves me. But I wonder if you would just say a little bit more about that, about you would still own the label evangelical proudly. The Bible still matters to you, doesn't it? I mean, you haven't thrown it out.
No, not at all. I think that I take the Bible very seriously. It's a complex book. I think we have to not be naive in the way we lift texts out of the Bible and just apply them to current situations. So, for instance, the world of the Bible knew nothing of committed, faithful same-sex relationships in the way that we understand those today. When it talks about, when it talks about homosexuality, and even using that word, you see, for instance, is interesting. It's a very recent word. Actually, it wouldn't have been a word around in Bible times, but we translate certain texts with that word. But quite often in talking about same-sex relationships, it would be thinking much more in terms of promiscuity, possibly abusive, coercive relationships. It might have been thinking about even prostitution in religious and cultic contexts. There were all sorts of different ways. And what it certainly wasn't talking about is people entering a faithful and committed partnership that we understand gay people enter into today. So I think we have to be terribly careful how we use the Bible and use certain texts within the Bible in the current context.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to sort of land our conversation. We could talk more, and I feel like there'll be many people at All Saints who might want to say, "Oh, David, tell me more," and I'm sure you'd be willing to have those conversations. But can I finish by asking you about your hopes? Because I think there's something about, I do think being retired in ministry is a real gift, and it's a gift to have you as part of our church community, because I guess you begin to bring a perspective that when you're in the throes of it all, you kind of get bogged down a little bit, if I can be perfectly honest. We are in a situation in the Church of England where some of us think one thing, some of us think another. A lot of shouting, going backwards and forwards. I suppose I want to ask you, what are you hopeful? Are you hopeful for the Church of England when it comes to these issues? And then do you have a hope? I don't know if it's possible to do those two questions. Can I throw those at you?
Yeah, no, I certainly have hopes and fears about where this all might go. I'm hopeful, of course, because actually in the end, truth will win through, and grace of God has steered the church through many crises in its time, and I'm sure that we will negotiate this particular one. But I don't want too many people to get hurt in the process, and that's always the fear. That's always the danger. I hope. I would hope that we can have good dialogue and biblical dialogue between different perspectives within the church. I think that's terribly important, that nobody claims the moral high ground. I don't look at heterosexual relationships and think that the church or the world has got those particularly well sorted. So why do we actually project all our anxiety about human sexuality onto one particular aspect of it? And we actually need humility and grace with each other in all circumstances. And the church should be a place where that should be paramount. So I hope for that. I hope that even if we don't get to places of agreement, we might have respect and a greater degree of mutual understanding. I think that's terribly important. I don't see this as an issue that should be causing irrevocable division in the church, even schisms and splits. I think that it's a second order issue, if I can put it like that, although I know that there will be evangelicals who say, no, it's an issue of Scripture. Well, it's not. It's an issue of interpretations of Scripture. It's not that one side has got Scripture and the other side hasn't, and I think that's terribly important. So those are some of the things that I would be hopeful and concerned about at the moment.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time this evening. It's good to have this conversation. And I hope for those of you listening and watching this, I hope that what you're perhaps taking from all these little series is that please, let's keep talking, let's keep listening. But above all, particularly in this Pride Month, let's just keep listening to the voices of people whose lives are most directly impacted by all of these conversations. So thank you for tuning in. Please look out for next week's interview. In fact, and there may be a bonus one. I may have got 2 in the offing, so keep an eye out for that. But thank you for tuning in. And as always with these videos, happy Pride Month. Bye-bye.